Hi, everybody, and welcome to the Digital Mindfulness podcast. This is episode number 6. Hi there, and welcome to the Digital Mindfulness podcast. I'm Lawrence Ampofo. I'm really excited to welcome today's guest on the show, who is Tristan Harris. Tristan works on behavioural influence and ethics at Google. He's been developing a framework to help product designers align their choices with the way that users really want to live their lives, whilst at the same time supporting their overall well-being and their attention. Tristan has led what are called design sprints, and I'm super excited to find out what those are, with various teams at Google, and has even worked with the world-famous Zen mindfulness master Thich Nhat Hanh. Tristan's also working on an independent design movement for time well spent, which is a little bit like the organic movement for farming, to shift from an economy that goes from a race to the bottom for seducing and taking people's attention to an economy that's competing to create net positive contributions to people's lives. So, Tristan, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
Great. So Tristan, first of all, I'm fascinated to know what is a design sprint, and what was it like working with Thich Nhat Hanh?
Yeah, so the background on that conversation or that meeting was about a year ago in October. Thich Nhat Hanh came to Silicon Valley, and he was traveling, to visit various technology companies. But there's actually a great Guardian article written about the motivation for his visit, and he was genuinely concerned, to be honest, about how, especially people's relationship with their phones, was changing the way that they were able to relate to themselves and be in touch with themselves and be in touch with people around them, and specifically how it would affect their attention and their well-being. And he had a visit planned to give a talk, several talks around the valley, and one of them was at Google. And the people who organized that visit knew about the attention design kind of ethics work that I'd been doing, and they basically said, influential designers you can find. And so I ran around and I found some of the leading designers of various products. And we ended up having a 2-hour meeting, which was incredible. And it was between, some of the leading product designers and, 9 or so of Thich Nhat Hanh's crew of monks. And we had a meeting that was basically about what does it mean to design for people's attention and to listen more carefully and more deeply to human values that you're designing for, which is controversial because, there's a kind of bigger conversation this is a part of, which is, are people's behaviors with their devices a reflection in each moment of what they're really after, of a genuine choice, of a real choice, or how much of what we're doing with technology is kind of something else. We check our phones 150 times a day is the average number. So, is that 150 conscious choices, or is there something else that maybe in the last 10 seconds that caused you to pull over your phone and just quickly check, the screen, right? So anyway, we had this meeting, and it was just not your average day at work, and it was really profound and pretty incredible.
Fantastic. And can I ask, what did he have to contribute to that discussion?
Various things. So he actually came with, not him personally, but the group came with a list of requests and suggestions and asks which weren't down to the pixels on the screen. They weren't saying, "Gosh, we really wish that this color was blue instead of red," but it was instead about things you might expect, but of the things that are most relevant on that list, the major ask that he had was that the designers of the technology go on a meditation retreat. And the reason that he asked for that, which I kind of got after from thinking about it more and why that was so important to him, is that if you're a designer and you care about these issues and you care about designing for someone's well-being, you can't really come up with the right answer unless you're really in touch with what's going on, yourself in your use of technology. And his major kind of request and ask was to bring the designers on a meditation retreat and invite them to go on one. And that ultimately didn't happen, or at least maybe it's happened independently with some of the different designers. But that was the major ask. There's other things we talked about, which I mentioned in the TED Talk, that what if instead of a spell check on email, you had a compassion check? Meaning, what if when you're writing an email to someone, it highlighted the words in yellow that might be accidentally perceived as abrasive by the other person? And so it was things like that.
That's really, really interesting. You've done all of this work with Thich Nhat Hanh. You're doing like this incredible work at Google, but every superhero has a background story. And so, what's yours? How did you come to this? How did you get inspired to work with the ethics of technology?
So I personally was part of a lab at Stanford in college called the Persuasive Technology Lab. And there was a professor named BJ Fogg who basically taught a whole class on how to apply psychology principles in social psychology and habit formation and persuasion and things like that, and apply it to technology. And this class I took was actually before the iPhone. So this is when phones were just, like the Nokia, sort of texting, whatever you call feature phones. And we learned all about these principles about how to help people create habits. And, mostly people wanted to help people exercise, floss, create the habits that people wanted to create. But as we're learning these tools about how to essentially persuade or induce habits in others, there was never really a conversation about ethics. There was only one class on ethics. And frankly, the professor didn't know the answer at all. He said, I don't know what the answer is to essentially, once you know the rules of psychology, what is the ethics of applying those rules? And there's a lot of influential people in that class. My project partner in that class was one of the co-founders of Instagram, believe it or not. And we actually even created a thing called Send the Sunshine, which was a little app that noticed when someone one of your friends was in an environment that had bad weather for several days in a row, and then it would prompt you to send a photo of sunshine to that person to cheer them up.
Oh, fantastic.
Which is funny because it's very similar to much of Instagram today.
Yeah.
But again, a lot of the alumni in that class went on to join companies like Facebook and join Zynga and join these companies that use these principles of psychology to help create more engaging products. And again, though, there's this question of, well, is any of this good for people? How do we know that it's improving or creating a net positive contribution in people's lives? And what does it mean to ethically persuade someone? So I got very, very interested in that, and a few years ago started, focusing on the ethics side of it. And that's not in any way, by the way, speaking on behalf of Google's views on this. This is just something I'm personally very, very interested in, and is concerning and also really interesting to me.
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, this when kind of from reading your website through and listening to the videos, that the different talks that you've given, this definitely comes through. And one of the really interesting things you talk about is this need for creating high quality digital communications. Could you just explain what that is?
Yeah, well, really that in the TED Talk was about asking what are the design goals behind the products that we use, because the way that the design goal is stated determines what kind of design we create. So in the TED Talk, I give this example of better interpersonal messaging, or what does it mean to design an interpersonal messaging or chat kind of client that takes us out of this all or nothing relationship with technology, where we either disconnect and we fear that we're missing something important, or we get connected but then we get interrupted all the time and we get distracted all the time. So we talked about how would you design that differently? And there's a practical solution for this. There's a way of thinking about it that I give in the talk. But the solution comes from a difference in how we define the goal of messaging and chat. Previously, if you talk to the product managers for a lot of popular chat clients like WhatsApp or Facebook Messenger, they'll actually say that the goal is when you send a message, we reliably deliver your message, right? What better goal is there for a messaging client than when someone wants to send a message, it delivers the message? Very simple, very clear. Why does it need to be any more complicated than that? But if that's your design goal, then the way that the interface will be framed will be only about delivering messages, in the minute, in the moment, as quickly as possible. And it doesn't account for the externality that gets created of the ways that we accidentally interrupt each other. Right? And each time we interrupt each other, it actually costs us about 23 minutes on average to resume focus. And we actually cycle through 2 different projects before coming back to the original thing that we were doing, which is awful. And the second research finding from this woman, Gloria Mark at UC Irvine, who's discovered all this, is that if you look at an hour of someone's activity, and in that hour you see how frequently they were interrupted by someone else externally, if you look at the next hour of their activity, they appear to self-interrupt more. So in other words, what appears to be happening is the more external interruptions you get, it's as if it's increasing the clock rate of how frequently we self-interrupt or do sensation seeking. So there's serious cost to the way that we accidentally bulldoze each other's attention, because oftentimes it's not even that we actually needed to interrupt that other person. It's just that that's how the design was. When you send the message, it delivers it. So the goal of the way, how do you fix this? Well, you can fix the design, but to fix the design, you have to have a different North Star. You have to say we're designing for something else. You have to say, what is designing messaging really about? And it's not just about delivering a message. Delivering a message is about what is the highest quality way for 2 people to communicate and understand and respect each other, right? Meaning, what would 2 people say is the goal of their communication? And it wouldn't just be that when I talk, it hits the other person in the face. It would be something like, when we're communicating, there's as much understanding, presence, transparency. There's a whole bunch of values that you might include in that. And so we have to think carefully about the design goals that we set up, because that's what frames, what we design and how it works.
This is fascinating, because if you're talking about being interrupted and just the effects that has on our cognition and on our attention, and this has massive implications, not for just personally how we live our lives and how we interact with other people, but also at a business level at our places of work.
Absolutely, it harms our productivity on the sort of market or workplace level, and on a personal level, it's harder to control the nature of our own thoughts. I mean, the thing that concerns me about this personally is, if we were all, I don't mean to be alarmist, but I do think, if we were to all eat food that was not good for us, right? It would show up on our bodies and our skin and in our long-term health outcomes, right? And so in other words, if there's something that we're consuming that's not good for us in food, it shows up somehow. Our sensory instruments can detect it. If there's something that is harming the our attention, or changing the way we use our attention in some way. If you look around the world, you see the same people walking around with the same clothes and the same things. They're all doing the same things. And yet inside, their attention is working very differently than it used to work. And it's not detectable because our way of detecting it is to examine our own attention and how it's being used. So this is the thing that's concerning to me, is that our attention is really precious. It's how we allocate, our potential, right? I mean, it's what allows us to do the things we do, to relate to the people we want to relate to, and to work on the things we want to work on. And we should really treat it as a precious thing that needs to be protected and conserved, and be really careful about it, because especially for the first time in history, all these designers of technology products are affecting it in pretty dramatic ways.
So, I mean, I know that a lot of people are probably thinking now, like, this all sounds fascinating, but how does the technology we use, or how does the way we use technology nowadays really affect our attention so badly?
Well, I'm not sure I would always characterize it as badly, but I think it's back to the things we were talking about with interruptions. So, we, for every external interruption we get, it creates that 23 minutes to get back to what we were doing. Increasing the self-interruption rate. This woman, Gloria Mark, has basically shown that in some form or another, we self-interrupt about every 3.5 minutes, which is crazy. So 3.5 minutes, there's some form of self-interruption. I don't mean that you're switching windows or you're, doing something like that. It could be anything. It could be, you're doing something and then you reach for a piece of gum, or you get a snack, or you go to the bathroom, or you come back and you're writing paragraph 3 of an email, and then you hit a snag, and then you quickly check Facebook and come back, right? It's very hard for us to hold our attention. And the way we use our attention physiologically is so driven by the environments that we're in. If you have a very distracting environment in which things are buzzing at you all the time, how we respond to it isn't so much a matter of choice, but our physiology. Your eyes are tuned to respond to quick movements in your environment, or sounds, right? It's been shown that in open office layouts, it's much harder for people to, be as productive, because there's so many distractions all the time. In workplaces, if there's an open office layout versus a closed office layout with doors. I think of technology designers as kind of creating the open office layout for 1 billion people. They're defining the widths of the sidewalks and the speed limits on the roads and the number of cars on the roads.
Yeah.
And just like in urban planning, where we have these utopian urban planners who are really thinking about what makes a city livable, we need to ask the same question about technology. And what makes technology livable for not just our relationships to each other, but our own attention? Because we're designing something that gets down to the core of what being a human being is about. How, instead of how we use our legs and how we move around a city, it's how do we use our attention?
Agreed. I was at a conference recently, and I was speaking to somebody who was he's a senior staffer at an international media organization, and one of the things that he was saying was that for people who consume social media every day, particularly videos that are on a loop, like the Vines, like Instagram, etc., he said that more care needs to be taken by organizations to take care of the mental health of the people that see these videos on loop all the time. So if you're seeing, for example, particularly upsetting content on a loop, that has, he believes, he was saying that it kind of leads to things like PTSD and to other kind of mental illnesses. So I think that kind of dovetails really well with what you're saying in terms of how do we design these technologies so that they do have so that we are thinking about the effect that they have on people.
Right.
So Tristan, we were talking previously about attention and the effect that technology has on our attention. But I'm really interested, in order to kind of have a good digital life, is it down to our willpower? Can we just put the phone away and turn it off, or do you think technology itself can be built to make people more mindful, more conscious, or indeed healthier?
Yeah, so I think that we need to upgrade the conversation about this and the way that this takes place in our society. Willpower itself is even kind of a Western way to look at the relationship that we have to things. It's about resistance or something like that, and it's been shown. Obviously, there's some research by Roy Baumeister at Florida State University that our willpower, or our ability to use self-regulation about how we want to do things or resist certain kind of things, is like a depletable resource. And every single time we consider something or have to make a conscious choice, it's depleting this sort of finite battery of willpower, or what's called ego depletion, or essentially our self-regulation energy. So whether we want to believe it or not, there's sort of a physics to our ability to resist things that are irrelevant in our environment. And what that means is that every single time, if you're building an app or something like that, and you're putting a notification on a screen, it's as if you're depleting a finite resource that someone's having. So you can think of it like, you're actually creating an externality and forcing someone to even have to consider the thing that you've just put on their queue, right? Like every email is doing that too. So, I think that obviously in this conversation about how we want to have a relationship with technology, we don't want to design things in a way where we're abdicating personal responsibility or saying that people don't need to develop good habits or, be in control of what they want. But certainly technology can support people better if we design it better. And I think that that's where a lot of the work to be done needs to happen. It's sort of like being on a diet, and it's the difference between having a spouse that's on your team and doesn't bring home, grocery bags full of the stuff you don't want to be eating or you're trying to not eat.
Yeah.
Versus having a spouse that, that's on your team. So on your team or off your team. I think choice doesn't happen in a vacuum. Choice happens in situated environments in which things are easier or harder to do. And that environment in a case of a diet, it's more like a kitchen or a restaurant. But in the case of technology, it's the design of how things show up. And I sort of feel like it's not, it needs to be a lot better at kind of hiding the things that we don't want to be, having to consider all the time.
Well, this leads really nicely onto my next question, because in the TEDx talk that I'm going to link to in the show notes, you asked the question of what technology looks like when it's designed to generate positive human interactions. But I just really wanted you to share with the audience today, what do you think technology looks like when it's designed to generate positive human reactions?
Well, I'll answer that by mentioning the example in the TED Talk, because it's important to say that what does a positive human interaction mean, right? There's no normative definition of that. There's no I can say what a positive human interaction is and you can't say that, right? Mm-hmm. Each of us are going to have different answers about what a positive human interaction would be. But in the TED Talk, I give the example of the way couch surfing measures success. And if you didn't know, couch surfing, is a website that matches people who are looking for a place to stay when they're visiting a city and traveling with someone who has a free couch and doesn't mind hosting you just for the opportunity of meeting an interesting international traveler. And you would think that if you're couch surfing and your job is to match people who are looking for places to stay, you would think that your design goal and the way you would measure success is just whether or not a person who is looking for a place to stay found one, right? That would seem like a pretty good goal. But that's not how they measure success. And the way they measure success is instead about creating a lasting positive experience between two people who've never met. And what that means is instead of counting someone who, counting the number of people who did a search for a place to stay in Paris and whether or not they ultimately did get to stay there, they instead count for a person who stays in Paris for, let's say, 4 days. They estimate the number of hours that those two people in Paris spent together. So they get a count of how many hours did these two people spend. And then that's not what matters, right? We don't want to count just hours spent. We want to know, are those hours positive? So what they do is they ask both people after their experience on a retrospective, looking back on the time you spent together, how positive were those hours? And they get this count of the number of positive hours essentially that were created between these two people. And then what they do is they subtract the amount of time that people spent on the website completely, because that's viewed as a cost to people's lives. And so what you're left with are these new hours that would have never existed on planet Earth if couchsurfing never existed. And so they're basically saying that what a positive experience is not just that I got a place to stay and I got a couch. A positive experience is that these hours that I spent with another person that technology facilitated were really time well spent hours, that they created some kind of meaningful experience in people's lives. They actually even do a retrospective 6 months later survey to confirm, how do you feel about it now? Because often, what feels good in the moment isn't what feels good or isn't the same as what feels good, 6 months later. And sometimes we have challenging experiences that might not be positive in the moment, but 6 months looking back on it, we feel was incredibly meaningful. And, couchsurfing in kind of a metaphorical way is more interested in measuring a meaningful positive experience as opposed to just putting smiles on people's faces. And that's really how they measure things. And I think that we can learn a lot from that example, because if you could imagine a whole world where everyone measured their success that way, right? Where the dating apps and the social networks and the professional networks and the, all these things that we use every day, LinkedIn, Facebook, dating sites, whatever, if they all measured not just that you swiped left and you got a match on a dating service, not just that you sent a bunch of messages or added a bunch of connections on a social network, but they instead measured what those things were really about, like whether or not you found what you were looking for on a dating site, or whether or not you found a job that you were really glad to get, right? Or just that there was some kind of net positive contribution to your life from the use of that service. And that it took as a cost, the time you spent that maybe you wish you hadn't spent on there. So we're really clear about the net positive contribution. And that's something that I really believe in, and it's the world that we're trying to create with the whole timewellspent.io conversation.
I was just going to kind of ask you to talk a little bit more about that project that you're working on, the time well spent, because it sounds like the two, the kind of the mindful metrics or the positive metrics and the time well spent projects are very much linked. Yeah.
Well, so, there's a few friends of mine that are a mixture of sociologists and technologists and entrepreneurs and philosophers who sort of see this problem, and we're all kind of concerned about it and thinking about it and think that there's something different that's really possible. And we kind of think of it like where we were with agriculture in the 1970s, we sort of realized that there was a need for something different. And we slowly sort of started sharing and trading practices and kind of defining that there might be some different thing we could call organic. And organic farming would be viewed as we could label a product that was farmed organically with a different label, so it could be valued in a different way. Because unless, let's say with technology, let's say you value success in a different way, and you say, I'm going to build a dating app in which people spend the least amount of time in it, and I measure success only when people find something that they're looking for. Well, as an application, you're not going to be rewarded, because the way that you get venture funding from venture capitalists or angel investors is by showing all the traction you get as measured in the hours people spend and the active usage and how often people come back. And instead, we're talking about a different kind of technology that's trying to minimize all that. It's saying we want people to spend the least amount of time, in this product. And so, if we're going to do that, you have to value success a different way. So we kind of think that there's, just like there was with organic and farming, where we said we have to value success a different way, and it's not just about farming the cheapest apple, which means that it's a race to find the ingredients or the fertilizer or the chemicals that will basically allow you to make the cheapest apple at scale. But instead saying there's other values, like, let's say, not using pesticides, so that it's maybe a healthier, nutritious apple, or, there's all sorts of differences that you could provide, but that might make it a little bit more expensive, but people have to value it a different way. It's not just that it's an 80-cent apple versus this 20-cent apple. It's that this one was farmed differently and measure success in a different way. And I think that that's what we could do with technology, and that's what timewellspent.io is about. And it's sort of an independent project that's kind of trying to start a conversation about, what an organic kind of technology would look like, and what standards would need to exist, how would they be measured, and, be marked as time well spent. That's what it's called. And there's a whole bunch of other factors. But you can imagine in the future app stores that give premium shelf space to these organic type technology products, and browsers that are aware of things that are designed this way and try to route you to those things. You can imagine news feeds that, when given the choice between sending you to a website that people commonly report that they regret spending lots of time on or feel that they don't have a lot of control over, and if there's some other alternative, help show the organic version instead of the high regret version. There's all sorts of things like that you can do if you create a new distinction in the economy.
That sounds totally fascinating. I love that vision of kind of future technology, and I was just going to ask you whether you think that technology, rather the successful technologies of the future are going to be ones that bring us closer together as humans, or whether the feeling of loneliness and stress that we have will still continue to abound. Or do you think it sounds like what you're saying is that there will be a mix of the two. People will have options to get the organic or the inorganic, if you like.
Yeah, well, there's lots of paradoxes in this conversation. So, while organic is great and we were able to create, again, pre-organic in farming, it was a race to create the cheapest product the best product for the cheapest price, right? And if someone else is able to create a cheaper product while using chemicals that you don't want to use, the farmer who's trying to do the thing without the chemicals, they don't really have a choice, because they'll go out of business unless they compete at that level, right? So we had to create this new distinction that said, no, we're gonna class this a different way. This is a different kind of apple. Until we created that farmer who was doing things without pesticides, they couldn't win. They were going to get killed off by this race to the bottom of the price kind of competition. With technology, it's the same thing, but the problem is with organic, that obviously sets up a class issue, because some people can afford the organic stuff and the other people can't. And that's really unfortunate. But it has been the reality of farming, right? Where there's some people who can afford certain kinds of food, and there's other people who can't. But because we've put ourselves in a situation, where that's kind of how things played out. I think with technology, it's sort of similar. The attention economy is like a race to get as much attention from people in the cheapest way possible. So instead of pouring on salt, sugar, and fat into your products, you pour on some more social obligation, you pour on some more exploding offers, you pour on some more slot machine type mechanics, and you get better at bringing people back and extending how long they stay and all this kind of stuff. And that's the attention economy. And that's a race, to seduce our instincts more effectively than the other person who's building apps, right? And so if we want to get away from that, we're going to need a different way to value success. And we're going to need something that lets us do things a different way. And I think that per the point you mentioned, one of the challenges is choices that an individual can make by themselves are always going to win out over choices that involve coordinating with other people. Because if people this might sound a little bit more abstract or complex, but if you think about kind of what's going on with technology, one thing that's going on is that it's as if we put a new choice on life's menu at any given moment, where an individual can find something that's more entertaining or stimulating than whatever reality is presenting to them at that moment. And this is kind of borrowing a point from Sherry Turkle, who wrote Alone Together, in that, at any given moment in time, you can find something that's either more entertaining or more informative or more, you can learn more from than whatever reality is presenting to you. And so, but of course, that choice is available to you as an individual, right? It's a choice for you to sort what's interesting for you. And so it's an isolating choice. It's a choice that's individualistic. And that's, of course, what kind of technology is offering us right now. It's really powerful. It's incredible. I mean, I could instantly, if I was bored with you, I'd be like, I'd find something really interesting I could find in literally less than 2 seconds. I could go to my watch later queue on YouTube and watch an informative video, right? I mean, I'm sure many people have tuned out of this podcast midway through for the same reasons. And it's not because I'm boring. It's just because we people can sort for themselves to find the most interesting thing that they'd like. And that sets up a really interesting dynamic, because if we're sorting choices for what we as individuals want, it sets us up more and more apart. So we're choosing for ourselves, and we get to live in our own world and get exactly what we want. And that's going to be the case so long as we're living in this kind of attention economy. And again, if we had something different, like a time well spent, organic kind of technology economy that included in it values that were about putting people together in ways that they wanted to be put together, there'd be potentially other choices on life's menu that were coordinated to bring us together.
So, Tristan, how do you spend your time well with technology? And what's the one thing that you could share with our listeners today about how they can go about spending their time well with tech?
Well, I struggle. I think one of the reasons people often assume that because I think about these things all the time that I somehow have magic answers, or my habits are great, or I'm incredibly productive. And it's actually the opposite. The reason I'm so fascinated by this and struggle with and want to fix it, want to work on this problem, is because I struggle with it tremendously. And everybody I know in every discipline of psychology that studies these areas where our psychology is vulnerable, whether we're, how we make irrational choices or how we're vulnerable to social psychology influence, they say that even though they know the most about it, it doesn't change the fact that they're affected by it, because it's just how we work, right? And so that's why I do believe that we need to advocate for better and different design. But I will say on a personal level, the things that I do, let's see, I try to use my phone intentionally. So one thing I do is wherever possible, I'll use a voice command for my phone, or use the search function. I use an iPhone, so I use the search function when I want to launch an app instead of scrolling over to the page where the app that I want is located. The reason for that is because if I express with voice or if I type, then it's a more direct to intention-based interface as opposed to browser menu-based interface. And it means that I get to go directly to what I want and I don't get pulled into something else along the way. Another thing I do is when I'm out with friends, I make it explicit that I'm going to put my phone away for about an hour and a half while we're having dinner. Mm-hmm. And then after about an hour and a half, I'll bring my phone out and make it very clear in designing how I want them to perceive that moment. I'll say, what I'm going to do is check into my phone for, a minute or two just to sort of see if there's anything we need to coordinate. And after a minute or two, why don't we check in about what we want to do next? And so usually both of us will bring in our phones, check on what we've missed, if there's anything we need to coordinate, people we need to meet up with next or something, and make it very explicit that there's a bound, that it's shared, that it's transparent. And it really helps because what often leads us to getting distracted and interrupted is this ambiguity about what if I miss something important, or I reach for my phone without even thinking about how the other person who's sitting there will interpret what I'm doing, and they see me doing it for a second, but then they don't know if I'm going to do it for 30 seconds or if I'm going to do it for 3 minutes.
Yeah.
And after the 10-second mark, they pull out their phone because they don't want to be bored, right? And so it's the ambiguity of our choice of our behavior that often leads us to these unbounded technology interactions. So I think we can do a lot by being more intentional and being more intentional in a sort of a social way where we're sharing that intention with the people around us.
Yes.
So there's a couple things I do.
That's great, being intentional and attentional. Fantastic. Well, Tristan, Thank you so much for spending time with us today. Where can people find out more about you and your projects and your work?
Well, we're looking to create kind of both a consumer movement and a designer movement of designers that are practicing a different kind of design. It's almost like the organic farming kind of design. And that can all be found on timewellspent.io. And there's a bunch of projects there. There's the TED Talk. Do recommend people, if they're interested in this, watch the TED Talk, share it, have a conversation with people around them. And if you know companies that are kind of looking to be time well spent companies and would be interested in being a part of that or defining what that certification would be and are interested in measuring themselves in terms of their net positive contribution to people's lives and have a real metric for that, they should all, get involved and go to the website. There's a way that they can sign up. So it's not a company. It's not a a formal thing. It's an independent sort of nonprofit-y project that we're just independently, organically getting off the ground, you could say.
Fantastic. Tristan, thank you so much for spending time with us, and I could talk about this all day, but it's been brilliant talking with you, and thank you so much for coming on.
Cool. Thank you so much for having me. Really appreciate it.
So that was really excellent information there from Tristan Harris. The deeper we go down the rabbit hole of trying to understand the nature of our relationship with technology and how we can improve it, the more fascinating this whole field becomes. Stay tuned for more episodes of this podcast because we've got interviews lined up with not only designers but psychologists, neuroscientists, and a range of other brilliant people making great waves in this discipline. As always, I hope you enjoyed this episode and that it inspired you to think and act differently about the way that you interact with technology. All of the sites and publications that we talked about on the show can be found in the show notes on digitalmindfulness.net/blog. Until next week.